Good evening, and thank you for joining us once again to our monthly series, Inspiring Ideas from Experts in the Field. The webinar is in our fourth year for NOFAMAS, and it is our hope that we can make quality farm management education easily accessible to everyone at any time, everywhere. My name is Anna Gilbert Muhammad, and I'm the Food Access and Webinar Coordinator for NOFAMAS. My email is anna@nofamas.org. Feel free to contact me with feedback about this webinar or with any food access, food justice questions, or about any of our webinar series that we have going. Before we start tonight's presentation, I would like to thank our sponsor for tonight's webinar, Massachusetts Dairy Farmers. Please go to their website, massdairy.com. Finally, many thanks to all the NOFAMAS staff who have helped to make this workshop possible. If you are not a member of NOFAMAS, please consider joining to support our education and policy work. You can visit our website, nofamas.org, for more information. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation. Without any further ado, I will turn it over to Jordan Schmidt and Sarah Chase.
So thanks everyone for being here. We're excited to be here. We're going to talk tonight about adaptive grazing and the reasons that we do that on our farm, which are kind of a combination of hope for ecological resilience and for creating healthy, nutrient-dense food, and the excitement we have actually for animal-based systems in both of those cases.
So this is Sarah. I'm the one in that Hawaiian shirt. I grew up at Chaseholm Farm. So just a quick little intro on me. And yeah, I've been there most of my whole life. I came back in 2013 and took over the farm. I'm a third generation dairy farmer on that piece of land.
And I'm Jordan, and I am going to be representing the nutrition part of this conversation. I came back to the farm with Sarah in 2013. Before that, had an environmental science and vegetable farming, organic vegetable farming background, but have since been doing mostly work with clinical nutrition. And I also teach for a nutritional therapy program called the Nutritional Therapy Association.
Okay. So this is just to give you a little overview of our farm. We're in Pine Plains in the Hudson Valley. This is our 8th year in business. We started in 2013 and transitioned our dairy herd to no grain in 2015, as well as getting our organic and 100% grass-fed certifications in 2017. Primarily, we do dairy. It's definitely like what I am most knowledgeable about, comfortable in, but we are aspiring multi-species grazers. We raise hogs out on pasture, and yeah, are in the beginnings of getting into more species too. On the other side of the screen here is a map that shows all of my dairy herds' daily moves mapped out. We'll talk more about that, but I wanted to give you a sense of like, what it looks like, how we make our paddocks, and what our pastures are like on the farm.
That's an app that we use. That's GPS that's guiding a varying grazing system.
So in order to fund our grazing obsession, we've developed a few ways to sell our products. This is, just a continuing intro on who we are and how we do things. But primarily, I sell my milk to my brother, who's a cheesemaker. He has a farmstead creamery on the property. And we also do a fair bit of farm store sales. We have a farm store right next to the dairy barn where we sell raw milk, yogurt, cheese, and our pork and beef. We started doing a pasteurized milk product last year, and that was so we could go to the city do green markets in New York City. And we have started also a little wholesale route selling at other farmers markets in our region with the pasteurized milk too. Another part of Chaseholm Farm is our sort of community focus. We do these burger nights in the summer. It's a popular event where we are both like showcasing our beef, but we also have our cows out on grass in a pasture right next to where people come and hang out. And it feels like a nice way to get the community sort of, close to the farm so they can see how we do things, get to be close to animals, and also just like, connecting people to an agricultural like past that a lot of them have. I feel like especially in our area, most people come from some sort of ag lineage, and it feels good for them to connect back to that. There's also these kids up on the top. We do a calf club program with the Pine Plains FFA, and that's a picture from that last fall. And then just our little farm store at the bottom, and me and a friend at a farmer's market.
And tonight we're going to talk about animal foods, so meat and dairy. And we're really talking about how shifting the context in which we produce animal foods has the potential to benefit our ecological and our human health. And I did say benefit, and from a media perspective these days, I think we're fairly inundated with a pretty different message. There's the perception that livestock farming is a major, if not the major, contributor to global climate instability. And I think the solution is often portrayed as shifting us all towards a plant-based diet for the health of our planet and also for the health of our bodies. And we totally understand the way that is appealing for many reasons. I think especially if you actually are far away from the way food is produced, it seems like a simple, sort of a cleaner solution. And I was a vegetarian for 12 years. I really, for all of these reasons, I understand where people are coming from. But I think also that both the environmental and the nutrition science in this case has often been asking the wrong questions, and also often using data or methods for collecting data that are also challenged in many ways, and then that data is often being misinterpreted. So we're going to explore that a little bit tonight and sort of ask some new questions. And we hope that this talk is really just a piece of an ongoing and dynamic conversation, not polarized, which it often is. We're so interested in something more nuanced in terms of how food systems work. And we're going to introduce the idea that rather than getting tied to whole groups of food being good or bad, that we'd be really better served by considering all food in the context of how it's produced. And in terms of that context, that farming techniques actually have a huge influence on the environmental sustainability and the nutrient density of animal foods like meat and dairy. And that when you are managing those farm systems in alignment with ecosystem processes, then animal-based farm systems might actually work to restore environmental and climate balance. And that in terms of nutrition, this is actually a worthy investigation because really, in fact, I think if we look increasingly at the data, animal foods can be really important, nutrient-rich contributors to healthful diets. And removing these foods actually can cause some detrimental nutritional impact. So we're hoping that we can consider all of these ideas as part of a larger solutions-focused conversation that is curious and compassionate and collaborative. Because there is so much damaging, polarizing conversation in the talk around food system reorganization right now. So tonight we're using our little lab, we're using our farm and my experience in clinical nutrition as our lens. So we'll dive in.
Okay, so let's talk first about grass-fed. We mentioned earlier that we are a 100% grass-fed dairy. And this can be a little confusing because grass-fed is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but not everyone who says their products are grass-fed means that their farms are 100% grass-fed. It could be, the label can be misrepresented. At Chaseholm, we graze our dairy herd in relatively small paddocks and move them frequently, at least once after every milking. The cows are getting moved through a field, like they don't return to any particular paddock until the grass has fully had time to recover. And we're aiming to mimic the impact that large grazing herds made on our nation's prairies years ago with management-intensive grazing. So on the prairie, the huge bison herds would trample and eat their way through huge swaths of land, moving both when predators caused them to and when they had, totally trampled and peed and pooped on the grass they were eating, and they needed to keep moving to find fresh grass. And the reason that it feels valuable to us to be mimicking prairie is because the prairie was and is in some parts still home to some of the deepest topsoil in the world. And ruminant livestock paired with the grassland plants created those prairies, created that topsoil. And I always really appreciate this fact that prior to 1800, there were anywhere from 30 to 60 million bison on the plains of America. And pound for pound, that's like almost exactly the amount of ruminants that or cattle that we're raising in the United States today. And there was no runaway greenhouse gas issue then. And there was an incredible nutrient-rich topsoil. And the difference is the way that animals are interacting with the land. And bison weren't the only ones to rotate themselves on pasture. Rotational grazing was also practiced by herdspeople moving livestock throughout the world. But the industrialization of our food system led to the removal of cattle from land in lots of instances. So dairy cattle as a whole group generally spend very little time on grass. And most beef cattle are finished in feedlots. And if these cattle are grazed, they're often set stocked. And what set stocked means is that they are on grass and grazing, but that they are not moved. So, for example, on like a 15-acre field that I might let my cows graze in for 10 days in distinct separate paddocks, a set stock cow would get the whole field all at once and probably for more than 10 days, maybe even a whole summer. And this practice means that the cows will overgraze the plants and stunt their growth, and that in turn limits the plant's ability to create healthy soil like we've seen on the prairies. So the graphic on the right is an image that a friend made for us when we were designing our yogurt label, and we love it because it really makes the cow's relationship to the whole plant the most important thing. And by grazing cows in a rotational way, we can support plants and make powerful changes to our pasture. And here are some photos from Chaseholm. In the first, you can see the dairy herd grazing a young Sudex summer annual. And in the second, we've got a dry cow heifer group that is about to be moved on a permanent pasture field. We use simple single strand polywire. So that's an electric fence. It's just like a braided wire with some metal in it that we can give an electric charge to, and that our cows pay very close attention to where that is. And that's how we divide up our paddocks. It's easy to take down and put up. And yeah, we frequently change the sizes of paddocks depending on what we're aiming to do. So I've come to call our grazing style adaptive planned grazing. We move our cows every day, and often many times per day, especially in the early spring when we're trying to make a more intensive impact. We plan out our grazing moves. We have like a big, a calendar, a chart of our grazing plan, but we use the eraser often, and we allow our grazing plan to be responsive to weather events like extreme heat or tons of rain and other issues that might present themselves on the farm, including like that we have burger night and we want our cows to be in one particular paddock. So we always get them there. And we schedule our burger nights to make sure our grass can be recovered. But when grass is growing quickly, like in May and June, we will rotate our animals quickly. The rotation might be as short as 18 days in the spring, but by July and August, when our farm, which is predominantly populated by cool season grass, is hot and that grass is growing slowly, we also slow our rotation down to give the plants more time to regrow and recover. And our rotation at this time of year might be as long as 60 days. And for us, that means that we have to add acreage to our rotation as summer heats up. This image shows you the previous day's paddock right alongside the one that the dairy herd is in. And you can clearly see the graze line where the fence is. And that's something that, I love this picture for that. You can see the obvious height difference and what the cows get to eat on the day that is and from what they ate the day before. You can also see that we don't let the animal take the whole plant. So the more green leaves that are left after a grazing event, the faster a plant should be able to use photosynthesis to recover its lost mass. It has also been shown to be true that if you continually graze more than 50% of the plant, you'll be contributing to exacerbated root system die-off, as the plant will need to be mobilizing energy so that it's stored in its roots to replenish itself above ground. So if your root system is weakening, then so is the soil's capacity to improve itself. Reduced root mass will mean reduced water holding capacity, reduced mineral cycling, and reduced carbon cycling. We're going to look at that closely with this next slide here. Okay, so the first image in the left corner gets you to see the way the plant cycles energy and how that relates to what happens in the soil. And then I want to further relate that process to how cattle are an important part of it. Okay, so the plant uses photosynthesis to create carbohydrates from carbon dioxide and water. And those carbohydrates are used for everything. They help to grow more plant. They get sent into the root systems to grow more roots. And they are also exuded by the roots to feed soil organisms. And these organisms become sequestered carbon through their life cycles, as do the roots of the plants as they decompose and grow, as a natural process of the plant continuing to grow. And the more capacity that a plant has to make carbohydrates and send them down into the soil, the more capacity there is for cycling carbon, and thereby building healthy, fertile soil. And so this is where the cows come in, because they are perfectly designed to eat pasture plants and turn them into fat and protein. We'll continue talking about cow digestion, but for now, let's focus on what the cows are doing for the pasture. And the cow is actually encouraging the plant when she takes a bite. It's sort of like setting a reset button. When she takes that bite, the plant has to reconsider its reproductive strategy. So instead of sending up a seed head, the plant will then send out tillers. Tillering is a form of asexual reproduction that means that the plant sends out tiny new versions of itself from the crown rather than dropping seeds to plant more of itself. And it's a cool way to reproduce because it means that we don't have to wait a whole year for this plant to, have made more. It comes out right from the bottom and they're right away able to photosynthesize. So tillering means that the plant is growing larger above ground and giving itself more photosynthetic capacity from which to support more underground growth in its roots. And after the cow takes the bite, the plant tillers and is enhancing this whole process, thereby also enhancing the ability to cycle nutrients, develop mycorrhizal relationships, and trade in exudates that foster communities of microbiology. And as long as the cow cannot take a second bite, she's helping that plant to thrive. But if a cow is allowed to bite again from the plant she's already bitten, then she's reducing that plant's ability to cycle carbon.
Maybe not literally the second bite, but if she comes back.
Yeah, if she comes back before that plant is fully recovered, if the plant is trying to regrow but hasn't been able to do its thing yet, then the cow is damaging the plant, and that's the definition of overgrazing. And so, therefore, animals that are set stocked are by definition overgrazing. And this is a slide from Sarah Flack that just sets out some basic grazing guidelines. We were talking about these, but I like the way she makes it really simple and clear. So variable regrowth periods, that's that idea of, in May, maybe it's 18 days, or if there's a lot of water and the temperatures aren't too hot in midsummer, and also short periods of occupation. And that's that idea of not set stocking the animals. You want to be able to move them on quickly so that you can let the grasses recover before the cows need to come back to that same piece. And just, Sarah let us use this slide, and she's awesome. You should definitely check out her book, The Art and Science of Grazing. But she also did a NovaMass webinar last August, and I think that's archived, so you could check that out too.
And put this slide in here to start to get into the conversation about the way that we collect data about these systems. So in order to have a really meaningful conversation about the environmental and health impact of animal foods, we really need to look at how we are gathering our information about what these systems do, both in terms of the agricultural system and in terms of human health. So we'll start with the agricultural system, but livestock-based systems are really a kind of a scapegoat in the discussion on climate change and nutrition right now. And there's a pretty big momentum with the perception that that these systems are damaging for the climate, or the animal-based systems are damaging for the climate. So when a research paper does get published with using pretty questionable methodology, what we've seen is that the headline gets published right away, and it kind of adds to the milieu or the idea that these systems are problematic, even when the paper is then something about the paper or their methodology is retracted and they have to publish either a correction or republish the paper. Those corrections aren't always, they're not publicized very well. It's kind of like once that information is out, once the headline is out, it has a life of its own. And when we look at the data presented on food systems, we want to make sure that we're taking a closer look at what questions are actually being asked in the studies, and then how the data that's collected is interpreted. And even though the scientific method tries to avoid bias, none of our data gathering is free from bias. So we always want to explore kind of what the biases in the process were. And one of the lens issues, like how we're looking at this, that's challenging for gathering data about the kind of system we're working in, is that we don't actually treat our food systems as functional ecologies. We don't study them like that. We treat them as more industrial systems or systems of production, or we look at fractionated parts of whole systems. And we tend to ask questions and gather data that reflect that view. So when we're studying how water is used in systems, how greenhouse gases are moved through systems or produced by systems, energy consumption, and even our understanding of what the net production is of a system, we're kind of they're all falling into that category of asking questions that fit more kind of industry or fractionated parts than a whole ecological system. And the water footprint or water use is a good example. So when we're looking at a farm system, I would argue that we really want to look at what's called the water footprint, which is a measurement of the whole water, of the water used in the system, but also where that water was coming from, what the source of the water was, and what happened to the water after it went through the system. So how much water was needed to dilute pollution, for example, that came out of that system. And so in the water footprint, we have these three kinds of water. We have green water, which is the rainwater or soil moisture that interacted with the system. We have the blue water, which is the groundwater or surface water. And then we have gray water, which is how much fresh water did we need to dilute the pollution that came out of that system. And when you look at grazing systems, they're sometimes portrayed as really water intensive based on another kind of analysis, right? Which is how much water, just total water, does it take to produce one unit, like a burger, that's coming out of the system. And I would argue that, instead, so in those kind of analyses, grass-fed systems look like they're quite water intensive. But if we break it down and look at the actual water footprint of those systems, then we're looking at the fact that most of the water that is being used in our grazing system is green water, right? It's rainwater that's falling on that land anyway. And in fact, the way we change the ecology by changing the pasture composition and improving the soil actually really means that not only are we using mostly rainfall, but we're actually over time maximizing that rainfall as we improve the ecology. So we're mostly using this green water. And then if we look at what that water is able to do as it travels through the system, if the soil is improving and the water is infiltrating more slowly, it has a much bigger impact. It could create or contribute to lots more life in that soil. And the runoff is really different. So the pollution that ends up at the end of that system has a really different impact than a more industrialized livestock system. We also want to be asking, changing the questions we're asking when we look at greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a picture of a life cycle analysis, or it's an image from a paper. It's not actually the picture of the analysis they did, but it's a graphic from a paper that was done at White Oak Pastures in Georgia, which is a multi-species grazing operation. They had a third party come in and do a carbon and resource analysis on their farm. And this is a really good start, I think, in terms of data collection, because one of the first things that happens with greenhouse gas emissions is that, like, for example, there's a comparison that's often made between greenhouse gas emissions of livestock production and compared to transportation emissions, and they come out comparable, or sometimes the livestock operations come out worse. But in the study that most of that information is drawn from, they compared all of the inputs from the entire chain of livestock production. So emissions from everything that goes into producing a burger, from feed production to transport to packaging. They took all of that emission output and they compared it just to the tailpipe emissions from the transportation industry. So AKA really not everything that goes into our transit system. And so the first question we need to ask is, like, are we comparing systems to systems? And the second thing is that we need to expand even our definition of a life cycle analysis. So rather than thinking about just the production end, everything that goes into producing a product, when we're thinking about a food system as an ecological system, we want to think about it actually as an entire cycle. So when we're looking at carbon, we want to think about not only what's being emitted in the production system, but how the ecosystem is interacting with that carbon. So what is also being potentially stored? Is this actually a cycle? And what does that cycle look like at, net at the end? And in this picture, they're showing at the bottom, some of the things that would be really useful to measure that aren't typically measured in the way we study these things today. So what's the whole carbon footprint, including sequestration, including soil building? What's that water footprint? What is the ecosystem quality? So what are we doing? Are we changing the ecosystem in a beneficial way? Are we expanding the biodiversity? Are we expanding the life in that system? How are natural resources being used? And then also, what's its impact on human health? I would add community health. So this is just a conversation about sort of changing the conversation, because our conversation is only as good as our data, and our data is not adapted to studying these kinds of systems right now. And this is just one, this applies to looking at grazing techniques also. This is a study from the University of South Dakota, but they are starting to do a really exciting thing, we think, which is compare different kinds of grazing, grass-fed operations to each other, which typically grass-fed farming is lumped into one category that gets compared to, like, a feedlot finish for beef, for example. But we know, as Sarah's been talking about, that grazing systems are not all the same in their ecological impact. We have a lot of creative work to do in listening to the ecology and mimicking it in our grazing systems. And so this study was one of the first ones I can find that studies, like, more continuous grazing, different types of continuous grazing to this multi-paddock, more adaptive grazing, which is what we're doing. And they found that the greenhouse gas emissions overall from the multi-paddock grazing were much lower, which is exciting.
Okay, so at Chaseholm, we're just starting to gather data like that, and I have no doubt that we've got a ways to go to balance our system and become net carbon negative. But without even being there yet, we've seen changes. So this year, last year, 2019, we took soil samples and had them measured for their carbon levels, and we only have 1 year's worth of data, so I can't report anything too exciting, but we're really glad that we did it, and we're looking forward to measuring that again as the years go on. But from those soil samples, we did get to see that our soil organic matter has improved. We know we grow all our own forages at Chaseholm, and we've seen our stored hay get a lot better. And cow health has been the most obvious change. And there's many factors that go into this, likely genetic changes we've been making as well, but the cows have better condition now, and they make more milk now than when we first stopped feeding grain, and they're a lot more fertile. My vet bill has also gone down as a portion of our annual budget, and metabolic issues like milk fever and ketosis are basically non-existent. And observing cow health improvement feels to me like a sign overall that we're really promoting life. If the soil is healthy and the grass is more nutritious, then the cow is healthy and our beef and dairy is more nutritious.
Which is sort of our segue over into the nutritional side of things, but just a note, which is that when we're having this conversation about kind of plant-based agricultural systems and animal-based ones and ecological balance, we also need to be, we need to be having the same conversation really around plant-based systems. And I think sometimes people forget, they're like, oh, if we take the animals out, it's healthy. But really, when we're looking at most of the biggest source of plant-based nutrition in this country still today, it looks more like these pictures, right? We're looking at monocultures that are high tillage, that are, have a lot of input needed and are rapidly wearing out soil also. So even, when we have this conversation about what we're comparing, it's really important to understand that we have, we need to be thinking kind of about this nutrient cycling ecological system emulating in all of our food systems. And because the loss of ecosystem sort of dynamics, nutrient cycling across the board in our food systems is having an impact on our food quality and nutrition. So there's a general sense overall, even the USDA has numbers like this, that our food, that the micronutrient content, so the vitamins and minerals in our food has declined over the last 100 years, but the data is not really specific or good in this way. And so this is a couple of slides from the Bionutrient Food Association, who are starting to do some really exciting work actually quantifying the variation in the micronutrient density and the vitamin and mineral content of foods that are produced in different systems in different places across the country. And they have just preliminary research, but the data is pretty interesting, right? There's a big variation. The variation plays out. So one carrot in the study had 15 times the potassium that another carrot had in this study. And it matters the why. Why does this matter? Because our bodies really, they very literally run on this biochemistry. These are the spark plugs that make our biochemical processes work. And so we don't want, one of the ways in which we get less resilient to our environment as animals, as humans, is when we have to start budgeting biochemical reactions because we don't have the nutrients to make them happen. And then there's the, why, the additional why of specifically integrating animal foods like meat and dairy. So if our nutritional needs can be met entirely by plants, then why should we work so hard at making ecological systems that include animals? And this brings us back to the soil food web, which is what we've been talking about already. But instead of, carbon cycling, we can think about nutrient cycling. So this plant here, this is a little bit hard to see, but I chose this one because the cow is there showing us that they're part of this system. But the plant is they're photosynthesizing, they're harnessing all the energy from, the sun and the air and water, and they're making proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates, like Sarah was saying, are going down into the roots, and they're used to grow the roots, but they're also used to feed microbes that migrate from the lower parts of the soil to the root systems, and those microbes bring with them the micronutrients, the minerals specifically that the plant is going to need to become nutrient dense. So without nutrient cycling, without a healthy soil ecology, without life moving around in the soil and trading food sources, we actually there's no way besides human input to bring the nutrients into the plant system. And the way that the animals interact with the plants is partly by driving this continued flow, right? As the cow eats the plant has to regrow, has to put more sugar into its roots, is stimulated to keep nourishing the soil ecology, and they keep bringing nutrients to the plant. So we get this really increased nutrient flow with these pasture systems. And then we also need the cow as our nutritional translator. So we have these really wonderful, permaculture grasslands that we can't eat as humans. So when we've created this really wonderful nutrient cycling system in a pasture, but then we need some kind of translation for our digestive tracts to be able to use those nutrients, and ruminant animals are really good translators. So the cow takes in the grass, and it does get some, there is direct like sugars and proteins and fats in that grass, but most of the grass is fiber and phytochemistry. And then the ruminants, the animals that have these big microbial ecologies in their guts and their rumens are really well suited to translating fiber into nutrition. So into nutrition that we can access. Bacteria can always access fiber, but animals typically don't have great enzymes on their own for digesting fiber. So, or at least, our style of animal. So the cow takes in the fiber, and then all of its bacteria translate that fiber, digest that fiber, and turn it into fatty acids that cross over into the cow circulation. So cows are they can get so big on eating something that we don't think of as sort of calorie dense, partly because they're having microbes that are converting that fiber into fat, and then the microbes are actually dying and becoming some protein that the cow ingests as well. And so along with those awesome fatty acids that the cow makes, which are, help very particular to grass translation, there's a fat called conjugated linoleic acid that really only happens from this conversion of grass into fat. That's really valuable for our immune systems. But the microbes also make B vitamins. They also make fat soluble vitamins. So vitamins like A and D and E and K are translated into the milk and the meat in these animals. And we, there's plenty of argument about what our digestive tracts are designed to, human digestive tracts are designed to absorb. But I would argue that if you look at our digestive tract, we fall into that really omnivorous place in the spectrum of life. And our digestive tracts are very well suited to extracting nutrients from animal foods. This is a study. There aren't that many studies on milk from rotationally grazed herds, but this is one of them, and from lots of herds that are compiled together. But it did show that the fatty acid composition is pretty different from milk that is from cows that are not being grazed this way. And the way that it's different is that the omega-3 fatty acids are higher, which than omega-6 fatty acids in this milk, which is really helpful for our inflammation, humans' ability to anti-inflame. We need those omega-3 fatty acids to be up there. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is protein, because protein is also, there's lots of conversation around protein in the nutrition world, but animal protein, it has a really wide diversity of amino acids, and we build so much in our body from protein. We build all of our tissues. Our enzymes are protein, and they do all of our biochemical function. So many of the important communication systems in our body run on components that are made of protein, like hormones and our immune cells and our neurotransmitters, even oxygen delivery. All this stuff really moves forward because of protein. When we look at, this is sort of what I was talking about our digestive tracts, is that when we look at food, it's not just what we see under the microscope when we look at a lab assay. So if you take the broccoli and the beef on that plate, you might see that they both have certain B vitamins or certain amino acids, but for our particular human digestive tracts, a lot of those are going to be much more bioavailable in the beef than in the broccoli. And really, when it comes to human nutrition, the bioavailability matters. And just in terms of, this is kind of a mirror conversation to the one on gathering data in the ecological systems, but in the program that I teach at the Nutritional Therapy Association, when someone comes across a nutrition argument or a piece of nutrition information, we teach that it should be evaluated with three different lenses, three different ways of knowing. And the first, you can take the same nutrition information and think about what scientific research has been gathered about that idea, and how was that information gathered, and what was the interpretation. And then you can look at clinical experience. So what is happening clinically with that, with that nutritional information, what's happening in the field, how is it impacting people's health on a day-to-day. And then ancestral practice, so looking back into our traditional foods record and seeing, is there precedent for using this kind of nutritional strategy in the past, and what happened to people? Were people using this nutritional strategy and still maintaining robust health? And so if we briefly run through these, we have, when we look at scientific research, this could be an entire story, a huge presentation really, but I just wanted to come back to the same ideas we explored when we talked about the research on the ecological impacts of animal-based food systems. Because when we talk about the nutritional impacts and the science that we're collecting, we really want to just take a pause and ask, are we asking the right questions? How are we gathering the data? And how are we interpreting that data? And this is an example. This is a magazine cover of Ancel Keys, who is a 1950s nutrition researcher that developed and popularized the diet heart hypothesis, which many of us are familiar with. It's the idea that a diet low in saturated fat and cholesterol was the key to preventing heart disease. And this is a really interesting story. It's way too long for our time today. But the short story is that Keys ended up asking the wrong questions. He confused a correlation with a causation. So he made some big leaps at the beginning of his data collection. And then because he was so convinced by that big jump he had made, he started cherry picking his data. And especially as his hypothesis gained popularity, he further selected the information he was choosing to report on. And that kind of, the hypothesis kind of gained a momentum of its own, especially because it was backed, it got increasing institutional backing. And we ended up building an entire era of government endorsed dietary recommendations on this premise that most of us really believe. I mean, it was so pervasive that most of us still believe that diets that are higher in meat or dairy fat are associated with all-cause mortality or with heart disease. And the more updated data is starting to really not bear this out, so much so that the USDA even has relaxed its guidelines on dietary cholesterol in the last few years. But because when the popular kind of awareness gets so strong, that I think that change has kind of gone under the radar. We're still believing the kind of what had momentum. And so this, with nutrition systems, just like farm systems, we're often asking questions that lack nuance or don't take in the whole context. It's really hard and expensive to collect nutrition data rigorously. So a lot of that data is collected using things like food frequency questionnaires or dietary histories, like what did you eat for the last year? And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be that great at entering that. That's rife with the potential for pitfalls and biases. And then we struggle with the interpretation. So we often make pretty sensational claims that fit the kind of current nutrition party line instead of really reporting on the nuances or often the just like further questions that come up from these kinds of studies. And the studies on whole food balance, diets that include animal foods and vegetable foods are often small. They're fairly underfunded, but the ones that are showing up are really promising. Like there's some studies on things like the paleo diet and chronic illness, that are autoimmunity and diabetes that are recent and are showing really promising results. Which also brings me to the clinical world. This is a personal hero, Terry Walls, but she is an MD who is working clinically with this kind of nutrient-dense, animal food inclusive therapeutic diet. She's spent her career at the VA hospital in Iowa, but she's just part of a growing number of practitioners who are using these kinds of whole food, animal inclusive diets to have a really big impact on some of our most challenging modern health conditions or issues, like chronic inflammatory conditions mostly respond really well to a sort of bio-individualized version of a whole food, animal inclusive diet. And part of the reason this is because plant foods, I call them like the conversationalists in our nutrition world. They contain tons of information chemistry that's really interactive with our bodies. Animals really do most of their interaction and communication while they're alive, and when they become food, they're much more of sort of a base nourishment. There's not a lot of kind of talk that goes on with something like our immune system, for example. With plants, that's not true. A lot of the way that they actually positively impact our bodies is in this kind of call and response style, where the plant puts out actually a stressor, like an antioxidant might be actually a little bit of a stressor to our body, but my body hears that stressor and responds by getting more resilient. It says, oh, there's a stress in the environment and I need to build resilience. And that works really well if my body is resourced enough to do that conversation, that call and response. But when we get really sick, sometimes we lose the resilience that we need to do that call and response. And what I see in my practice is that people typically gain food sensitivities or lose tolerance to plant foods first, and that sometimes we have to do a lot of nourishment with an animal food base before we can really bring back that dynamic, healthy conversation with plant foods that's so important. And the last way, the last check is ancestral diets. And our way of collecting information about ancestral diets is very fraught, for sure. But these are some examples. When you do look back in the ancestral record, we have some interesting examples of communities that appear to be free of chronic conditions, chronic inflammatory conditions, that at least at certain times of the year ate really high amounts of animal foods like meat and dairy. In this picture, there's the Inuit in the tundra and the Maasai in Kenya, and some herding populations in the Swiss Alps. But all of those communities at certain times of the year, some of them ate almost 100% meat and or dairy, and didn't struggle with some of the chronic conditions that we have sometimes associated with those foods, which just opens up our questioning, right? Like, then what have we not understood? And I do think it's worth noting that when we have tried to find vegan populations, historically, like 100% plant-based diets, in the ancestral record where populations had really robust health, it has been hard to find. Like, we can't find them, which just means that we also want to really get curious about what kinds of, if this is a more modern idea to eat 100% plant-based food, then we want to be really curious about and careful about how we approach that, and maybe treat it more like an experiment than as a sort of given ticket to health. And that brings us back to Chaseholm, which, we are certainly not, we produce meat and dairy, and we're certainly not saying that every person should, eat all of our foods. That's definitely not our style. And dairy definitely can be one of those conversational animal foods. It can be quite, immune conversational with certain people. But what I will say, is that if you are eating dairy, then eating grass-fed dairy with this different nutritional profile can be really impactful move for your health. And also, we have this like sort of experimental, observational lens on our farm too, because people seek us out who have struggled to tolerate dairy in the past and are looking to see if a different approach will help their body, take in that food in a better way. And it's not 100% at all, but many people do feel that that's true for them. Like, they couldn't tolerate dairy before, and when they have the dairy from our farm, it's easy for their bodies to handle, which is really exciting to see. And this is just this is like a note back to that, like, if we're comparing the plants and the animal foods, then bringing in some awareness about what we're comparing is important. And when we're looking at dairy substitutes, we're mostly looking at these like seed or grain, not seed grain milks. And it's worth noting that ecologically, some of them are not so great either, in that, if we're looking at something like almond production, we're really challenged to find ecologically sustainable almond production right now. And a lot of these are also the ones that are found in the grocery store they're processed foods, so they're produced with a fair amount of filler or emulsifiers, that are things that are more challenging for our GI tracts. which is tough because people are often trying to find something that's digestively better, right, for them. And also these often they're really concentrating some of the most communicative part of the plant chemistry. So that's often the seed. And so we can end up with a lot of that, things like phytates or lectins or something like an oxalic acid that, depending on your individual biochemistry, could be a challenge. And in the Northeast, we're pretty well suited to dairy production, whereas with some of these, we can't really, maybe the soy and the oats we can grow around here, but most of the other stuff doesn't. And you could say the same thing with the meat substitutes. So, something like we can absolutely create, like with this bean burger, a very wholesome, plant-based, whole food, nutrient-dense option. But a lot of what's being sold as an easy meat-based healthy substitute really has a super long processed food ingredient list that many of the things can be pretty problematic for our digestive tracts or our immune systems.
And we're back to cows, which we thought would be a soothing way to end our talk. But really, we're hoping to sort of drop you off on this side of it with, some curiosity and, some new ability to ask questions about our food decisions and food systems, and help you think deeply about, what people are telling you is good. And we really believe that, we're not saying that like we have the answer. We believe that a solution to our climate's warming will need to come from all parts of our food system and society more largely too. So yeah, we're excited to take some questions and talk with you guys for a bit now. We're gonna zoom through a little resources page and on our contact slide.
All links for, I don't know if we send the slides out, which we could do. People can take out these resources. And
then wow, that was a great and in-depth presentation. And thank you for putting up your email address so that people can reach out to you with additional questions. We do have a few questions that came through, and a few on how you operate with your rotation and a few on nutrition. So I'll start with the grazing questions, if that's okay. There was a question that came in about your hay. Would it be a good idea to hay the extra land you use for midsummer grazing in the spring?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's exactly what I do. I try to make as much baleage, so wet, and filed and baled as I can out of my, hay fields. And that will go towards my dairy herd in the wintertime. Mostly I feed dry cows and heifers dry hay. But on the home farm, I'll send my cows in a shorter rotation along, like, usually the hillier pastures are ones that have been are super close to the barn and have been really just permanent pasture for a long time now. And I'll take my machinery out to the crop fields. Our farm has a fair balance of both kinds of land. And I'll just make hay in a day as fast as I can till our second time through the.
Okay. Another question in the hazing category, or the grazing category. How do you dethatch a field with light animals, such as goats and chickens who do not have the weight to break down the thatch?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, that's something that I struggle with even because I don't have beef cows. This is probably my pet peeve of dairy. My cows are super, they need the highest quality nutrition all the time. So I can't actually make them bob graze as much as I would like. And I can't people Gabe Brown out in North Dakota are able to do, where they just really keeping the cows tight together. We're fortunate that we're in a different ecosystem than him, so we have more water over here, and our decomposing process will happen faster.
Mm-hmm.
We were thinking this year about spraying like with a little backpack sprayer, like a bacterial sort of like a, I don't know, what would you call it? It's almost like probiotics to try to help you break down hay, because we bale graze all winter long. So we have these hay rings out in the field, and I don't like mind them so much, but we were just curious to like run an experiment and see if we spray some, will they return to productive pasture faster?
Mm-hmm.
What we really want to be doing in general is just encouraging microbial activity. So yeah, how can we do that best
Mm-hmm.
without just like trampling stuff into the ground?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. And if you can just stay closer to the mic as you're talking, that way you won't go in and out. Another question as it relates to grazing and livestock, how exactly do you know when to pull the livestock off? That was another question that came.
Yeah, that's another great question. I mean, I think it takes some practice for sure. But what we've done to to test, so we'll make paddocks of different sizes. If we are feeling tight on grass, we might make our paddocks a little smaller and observe the animals in the paddock. So if the cows are out there spread out, have their heads down, and they're eating the whole time that you've set out for them to have in the paddock, like then they've got plenty of grass. If the cows don't have grass left, they're going to come back to where you let them in from and stand, and maybe they'll bellow at you or something. But the cows can tell you a little bit that way. But besides angry cows, there's also looking at rumen fill. So on the right, no, right is reproduction. On the left side of the cow, I have to hold my hands out with right and left so I know my right and left apart. But on the left, the between the pelvis and the hip bone, or the hip bone and the rib cage rather, you'll be able to see their rumen just like totally like gas up and be really full. And if a cow is not full, there will be like a depression in that area. Um, so that's when we're trying to make milk, we're trying to put this stuff on cows. And same if you're finishing beef. And we, we might not want, we can like judge whether or not we have done a good job filling the cows by seeing that. And so I guess playing with different size paddocks while you're watching how like far down on the plant cows graze, while also balancing that with what you're seeing in the cow physiology and behavior.
Yeah, what Sarah's also talking about is looking at, I mean, what has taken practice also, and she's changed over the years, is kind of back to that like Sarah Flack idea of where she's looking at the height. She doesn't want cows grazing too far down on the plant. So the other way that she's like deciding when a pasture has had enough, she's looking at the cows to see when the cows have had enough, but also looking at the pasture to make sure that the cows aren't eating, depending on what she's interested in doing, she could change it depending on her idea, but she's looking for a specific amount of grass that's been eaten.
So yeah, and it could be like percentage of the plant, but you also, maybe you're like looking at the actual physiology of the plant, and like depending on which type of grass is predominantly out there or legumes, you might want to even change your grazing style. And it can be a little harder to say, you can like when the cow leaves, you want to see how much you have left, and get a sense of the percentage and see if the cows have eaten below growth points on the plant. And I guess you'd want to try to discourage them eating below those growth points. But an easier way to talk about it too is in recovery, we look for like 3 to 4 leaf recovery before we go back. So we're like, you walk around your field, you pick up a few individual like sections of a grass plant, and you count how many leaves from the base. You pull it right out of the ground from the bottom as close as you can get your fingers, and you count how many leaves. And you can do this 15 days after you grazed it, 30 days after, 40 days after, and see the change. And if you're Sarah Flack does say this in her book, but it was something that I've really valued as advice for how to learn this. But going to count grass leaves will like let you know that you're at least letting the plant recover the most. If you overgraze, well, not in the technical definition, but if you take the plant further down than you wanted to, it's okay as long as you let that plant recover completely. It's when you bite the plant again before it has had a chance to fully recover that you're doing any damage.
Okay. Do you worry about soil compaction?
Yeah. If it's really rainy, we might change our management style. We might spread our cows out, give them a larger paddock that day, or keep them in the barn for more hours on some stored hay. We try to keep our laneways consistent so that we're not like creating lots of new laneways all over the place. Plus, it gives us a chance to improve some of them as we're, you know, the dairy cows have to haul themselves back and forth between the barn a lot. So having good laneways means a lot. But yeah, I mean, we like in this time of year, it's really something we think about because the biology is not really going yet, and our cows, especially the cows that are outside right now, like our dry herd, we sort of confine them to a smaller patch so that um, they don't spread this part of the year. It would be a little bit of a negative impact. Plus, they're like eating all the grass nubbins as it tries to grow up. So we give them a small space, and I plan to do some sort of partial tillage this year. I'm going to plant a summer annual there. So we're going to try and get, it's going to be a mix. It'll have some tillage radish in the mix, but we're going to try to replace sort of like give that land some extra love with, plants that are going to do a super huge amount of photosynthesis, these like giant sorghum Sudan plants, plus getting like some daikon radish roots into the ground and trying to aerate the soil a bit. So that's how we try to counteract cow compaction.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a grazing app. Do you have that handy, the name of the grazing app?
Yeah, it's really great. It's called Pasture Map. I've really enjoyed it, and right now I'm using it like for free. It's something that you can subscribe to, and I think it costs like $500 a year. But I haven't yet paid for it, which means I'm losing some functionality of it, but it's primarily designed for beef producers. So I feel a little bit like I wouldn't be getting all my money's worth anyway. But I'm just letting you know, you can use it for free. You have to sort of figure it out a little bit, but it's super valuable. It uses GPS locations. If you have to communicate where your pastures are going with employees, it's a really indispensable tool to like have everyone on the same page.
Okay. And this is another operational question. How does this translate into a year-round operation?
Okay, so instead of just in the grazing season, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I mean, it might mean you're thinking about cover cropping and like where you're going to be putting.
Well, first of all, depending on where this person is located, like we feed 100% hay and baleage in the winter. So the cows will come off of pasture. We're always working on extending our pasture season. That's like one of the learning curves in this work. But sometime in October or November, the cows will come off of this rotational grazing system. And even before that, we might start feeding hay like in adjunct to the
to
grass.
Extend it a little bit.
And then Sarah's been making hay furiously all summer. And that's a really huge part of 100% grass-fed animal husbandry in the Northeast is your hay, because there's a big portion of the year when you don't want cows just all on the field, because that will create a lot of impact that would be detrimental.
But I was sort of thinking of it like how to continue doing this kind of ecological work in the other parts of the year also. And I mean, yes, cover crops for that, like how to have living plants growing in the soil, have their roots in the soil all year round. So that's one thing. But then we also feed our heifer groups and dry cows, so cows are not in milk, on pasture throughout the year. So we'll choose fields that we want to improve. And the concept is that by feeding hay on the field directly, we're not losing any of the fertility from the farm. So like making hay is kind of a process of like you're taking the thing that the land grew away from it. And so this is a way that we can give it back. We put the cows out there to poop and pee all over that place while they eat the hay, and they inevitably leave hay and strew it about and lay on it and stuff. And those become, is more bacteria food ultimately. And so that's one way. We sort of rotate through. So this year I probably used like 15, 20 acres of our farm as winter grazing lands. It's barely grazing, although the cows will always eat what they can from what's down there. You could do some stockpiling also to like make it stretch, but yeah.
Okay. This is a question about calves coming through. Any issues with raising calves? Do they develop slower?
My cows have gotten smaller each generation. And my calf management, so sometimes I raise them on nurse cows, which is like a fun experiment. I like believe that it makes sense that like a cow would do a better job raising a cow than I can. But anecdotally, I've also had like a lot of success raising calves on milk bars, which are, I use group feeders and I raise my calves on milk from the dairy herd. It's at least 2 gallons per calf per day. And I raise them on that milk for 6 months. And that's my standard calf raising way. And then if it's the summertime, it's like super bonus because they're out. We move them every day on grass. They get like a little slice and they'll have some hay and they get their milk. But they learn like the way of the farm. They learn how to expect to be moved every day and to start to, learn how to be a grass cow at Chaseholm. So we've had really good luck with that type of raising. Even our winter calves this year, they look really good. But they have gotten smaller. I think I would say more milk. That's like, and for longer. It's expensive to feed grain too, but sometimes it's hard for dairy farmers to put so much milk towards the calves. But I've found that it's worth it to get the cow you're looking for in the future.
Okay. This is a question concerning goats and chickens. How long would you give a field to recover with succession grazing goats and chickens?
And I don't know much about goats and chickens, I must say.
We're like, this is like the first year we're thinking about putting chickens in our process.
I mean, again, I don't know how. I know the goats graze a little differently than, they browse also. They don't just graze, but with chickens, like especially, meat birds, I'm like picturing the way that you'd move a chicken tractor. And I think that counting blades of grass would still be a really effective way to know when you could come back to a certain and I can't emphasize experimenting enough. Like you don't get it exactly right the first time or maybe any time, but you're always taking in data and it's really good to try to keep track of it so that you can improve for the next time through and watch how the animals respond, watch how the grass responds, and get a sense of like what you can do in your system.
Okay. This is a nutrition question as we're winding down in our questions. I noticed that in the study you cited the organic milk was lowest of all 3 in omega-3s. Do you know why that might be? Does it have to do with pasteurization?
It probably doesn't have to do with pasteurization. I imagine that all the milk in these studies were pasteurized. But does it I think that's really interesting. And we were actually noting, because that study was partially funded by Organic Valley, and we were having some questions about like, well, we always want to look at the funding source when we look at our studies too, but Organic Valley trades mostly in organic milk. They're establishing this grass milk line too. But it was interesting to me that was true. And I think partially because, I mean, maybe, and I really don't know, maybe some of the like rations, the TMR that they're using in the conventional operations is more tailored. Like they could be adding things like flax or something that would prop up the omega-3 content. So we don't really know what the rations were, but we do know that the grazed cows, it comes from grass for the most part, Yeah.
Okay. And our final question for the night, it's a two-parter. With this method, is your intention not to need to reseed at any point, and does it become self-sufficient?
Great question.
That is one. Yeah.
Good way to wrap it up, right?
Right now, it's funny. I've been spending the last 7 years really, like, I started when I first began farming. I was like, oh, this land is all old alfalfa fields. I need to really like till it up and reseed. And I like spent a bunch of money reseeding stuff and had mixed success here and there. But having mixed success made me sort of doubt my my like full steam ahead, till it up and replant it idea. And so I've also been just trying to improve existing pastures, and I've gotten more interested in no-till farming and this, really living this like everything we talked about today. So now the farm is fully in perennial pasture, and it does leave me wanting for these summer annual moments. So I'm not like, yeah,
Because
I am.
how she was saying that the grass on our farm and the perennial pastures is mostly cool season grasses, there's always a slump in the middle of the summer where you would wish for basically some warm season plants that don't grow perennially on our land.
I mean, it's super convenient in that way. That's like the most selfish reason why I want it, is because I want to be able to feed it to my cows in the summer, and I like to, it's like makes a huge amount of tonnage, so I want to be able to feed it as baleage in the winter. But also plants like corn, dare I say it, and sorghum Sudan, millets, all these warm season C4 grasses, they are so good at using photosynthesis to pump carbon into the soil. They pump the most in, like they just do it on like a whole nother level. And so if you're trying to get nutrient cycling in a field that is like slumped or like a little bit depressed, or like a field that's a little like worn out from whatever kind of management, putting in crops like that is a really awesome way. So we're trying to experiment with no-tilling into sod, which is like a pull your hair out kind of experiment. It's really so far been hard, but we're hopeful and looking at ways to like get summer annuals into our rotation without tillage, or at least without too much.
And one way to also bring seeds onto the farm sometimes is to bring hay from other places and feed it on the farm too. So there's like,
yeah, that's true. The bale grazing can help reseed in fields as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Wow, this was such a informative and in-depth presentation, and a fun presentation too, as we got a very wonderful view of your beautiful farm. Please, everyone, take down the email address, the website, and take a look at their farm. Will you all be doing any more webinars, or do you see any? I know in our current situation of COVID, in person is not happening so much, but do you have any more virtual presentations you'll be doing that you'd like to announce and bring our attention to?
We don't have anything planned, but if things do stay this way, then check our website. I think we'll do maybe some like farm tours when we're not even quite out on rotationally grazed grass yet.
Yeah,
next week. So, check us out. Maybe Instagram is a good place.
Instagram, you can see the cows get turned out for sure. You follow us.
Okay. All right. Well, you hear that, everyone. Follow them on Instagram, please. And this webinar was recorded. It will be uploaded to NOFA's YouTube page in a few days, so check us out there. Thank you both for the shout out with Sarah Flack. She was one of our webinar guests last year in July, and her webinar is still up. Please check that out as well, as they made a great reference to Sarah Flack. Thank you both, Sarah and Jordan, for your time tonight. Everyone, be blessed.